For years, Ornette Coleman was regarded by many critics and musicians alike as something of a fraud and a trickster. Miles Davis described his music as unlistenable. Roy Eldridge called him a charlatan. Apart from the fact that his music sounds like nothing that came before or after it, his philosophy of music represented a radical departure from the traditional bandleader-sideman relationship, as well as a reimagining of how a composition could be interpreted by a band or other ensemble. All hell broke loose when Ornette Coleman made his East Coast nightclub debut at the Five Spot Cafe in Greenwich Village on November 17, 1959. The 29-year-old Coleman arrived in New York having already won the approval of some of the most influential jazz opinion makers of the period. Ornette Coleman is doing the only really new thing in jazz since the innovations in the mid-40s of Dizzy Gillespie, Charlie Parker, and Thelonious Monk. John Lewis, musical director of the Modern Jazz Quartet, is reported to have said after hearing Coleman in Los Angeles. Not all of Lewis's colleagues shared his enthusiasm once they were given the opportunity to hear Coleman for themselves. Many critics, finding Coleman's music strident and incoherent, feared that his influence on jazz would be harmful. Others doubted that he would exert any influence on jazz at all. Musicians, always skeptical of newcomers and envious of the publicity Coleman was receiving, denounced him even more harshly than critics did. Some questioned his instrumental competence. The outspoken Miles Davis questioned Coleman's sanity. Not since New Orleans trumpeter Bunk Johnson, 2 decades earlier, had one musician split opinion so cleanly down the middle. Coleman was either a visionary or a charlatan, and there was no middle ground between advocacy and disapproval. The controversy raged, spreading from the music journals to the daily newspapers. Every VIP in Manhattan, from Leonard Bernstein to Dorothy Kilgallen, seemed to have wisdom to offer on the subject of Ornette Coleman. It is difficult to believe that Coleman's music was once the source of such animus and widespread debate. Who but Ornette Coleman could better represent change in music in the second half of the 20th century? The titles of his early albums affirm his self-awareness of the impact he would have. Tomorrow is the Question, The Shape of Jazz to Come, and Change of the Century, to name a few. What must have bothered musicians more than the unmistakable Southern dialect of Coleman's music was its apparent formlessness, its flouting of rules that most jazz modernists had invested a great deal of time and effort in mastering. It has often been said that Coleman dispensed with recurring chord patterns altogether, in both his playing and his writing. The comment is not entirely accurate, however. Rather, he regarded a chord sequence as just one of many options for advancing a solo. Coleman was always an outsider. While others fixated on the fluid virtuosity and harmonic sophistication of Charlie Parker, Coleman heard the bluesy cry in Parker's tone and the rhythmic unrest just beneath the surface. He spent his early 20s touring with carnival shows and rhythm and blues bands, suffering ridicule for his unconventional approach. He eventually found his way to Los Angeles, where he worked part-time as an elevator operator and began to find new allies amidst the disdain. With long hair and a beard, long before that look was in fashion, and wearing a heavy overcoat in 90-degree weather, Coleman scared the trumpeter Don Cherry at their first meeting. But the music drew Cherry in, and soon their symbiotic telepathy became similar to Charlie Parker and Dizzy Gillespie's. In addition to Cherry, such burgeoning master improvisers as the bassist Charlie Hayden and the drummers Billy Higgins and Ed Blackwell heard the magic in Coleman's concept and dedicated themselves to its ensemble realization. The year 1959 was an important one for Coleman and his band. He signed a recording contract with Atlantic Records, recording the first album to really present his new sound, Tomorrow is the Question. His quartet was invited to participate in what became a historic session at the Lenox School of Jazz in Massachusetts, being championed by John Lewis and Gunther Schuller, and the band began an extended engagement at the Five Spot Cafe in New York. Meanwhile, Coleman was developing an approach to his music that he was to dub harmolodics. Harmolodics may loosely be defined as an expression of music in which harmony, movement of sound, and melody all share the same value. The general effect is that music achieves an immediately open expression, without being constrained by tonal limitations, rhythmic predetermination, or harmonic rules. Coleman defined harmonics as the use of the physical and the mental of one's own logic, made into an expression of sound to bring about the musical sensation of unison. The term free jazz may have been used before Ornette Coleman released The Shape of Jazz to Come in 1959. However, despite the innovative modal experiments of Coltrane and Davis, jazz still largely followed its fundamental structures until Coleman's arrival. Conventional jazz harmony is religiously chord-based, writes Josephine Livingstone at New Republic, with soloists improvising within each key like balls pinging through a pinball machine. Coleman, in contrast, imagined harmony, melody, and rhythm as equal components. This philosophy, jazz critic Martin Williams wrote upon hearing Coleman's debut, was necessary to free jazz from its formal constraints. Someone had to break through the walls that those harmonies have built and restore melody. Melody was everything to Coleman. Loosening the constrictions did not mean that Coleman lacked requisite virtuosity, as Maria Golia writes in a new Coleman biography. Instead, he proposed an alternative means for its expression. This emerged in experimental improvisations like 1961's landmark Free Jazz, an album that practically defies superlatives in its historical importance, Steve Huey writes. In a jazz industry often obsessed with young lions, Coleman didn't make his recording debut until a month before his 28th birthday. Right from the start of Something Else, you can hear Coleman's mature style, even as he and Cherry push against the more traditional forms imposed by the pianist and bassist that the label brought in. By the following year, now accompanied by like-minded collaborators of his own choosing, Coleman moved to New York City and began a series of classic recordings for Atlantic Records, including The Shape of Jazz to Come, Change of the Century, and This Is Our Music, which lived up to their titles. He also began an extended residency at the Five Spot in New York City that solidified his role as the figurehead of the new music. Sporting a white plastic alto saxophone, abandoning traditional song form and chord changes, Coleman became the contentious flashpoint for arguments over the validity of the avant-garde. Critics were divided, pro and con, 5-star reviews against 0 stars, no middle ground. Some musicians rallied in Coleman's defense, others denounced him as a charlatan. It was the loudest argument in jazz since the emergence of bebop. Over 50 years later, it is hard to remember what all the fuss was about. Coleman's music is so naturally swinging, so melodic, so bluesy, especially in comparison to the more extreme abstractions of his near contemporaries, such as Cecil Taylor or Albert Ayler. But we take for granted how profound his influence was. Without Coleman's lead, neither the spiritual explorations of the late John Coltrane Quartet nor the elegant deconstructions of the Miles Davis Quintet with Wayne Shorter would have existed. Everyone from Yoko Ono to the Grateful Dead sought his collaboration. In harmonic improvisation, musicians contribute equally on their own terms, Coleman believed. From Ornette's point of view, writes Robert Palmer in liner notes to the complete Atlantic recordings, each contribution is equally essential to the whole. One tends to hear the horn player as a soloist, backed by a rhythm section, but this is not Coleman's perspective. In the music we play, he said of the performances, no one player has the lead. Anyone can come out with it at any time. Jerry Garcia of the Grateful Dead remembers feeling confused when first recording with the saxophonist. Finally, says Garcia, he said, "Oh, just go ahead and play, man." And I thought, "Oh, I get it now." If one listens closely for them, you can hear Coleman-esque accents in the most unlikely places. The piano soliloquies of Keith Jarrett and the improvisations of young hard beboppers like Wynton and Branford Marsalis. Sourcing from those examples alone, you can draw a family tree of most of the creative jazz and popular music of the past half-century. Yet for all that, Coleman's style of playing has never really replaced Charlie Parker's as the jazz standard, as many hoped and others feared it would. After his initial breakthrough, Coleman continued to push boundaries in his own way. He introduced more accomplices fluent in his language, Bobby Bradford and Dewey Redman, 2 other native Texans, who are featured on Coleman's brilliant 1971 album, Science Fiction. Coleman taught himself how to play violin and trumpet, adding new colors to his improvisational palette. He then began to expand his compositional outlook. His writings included works for wind ensembles, strings, and symphony orchestra, notably his symphony, Skies of America, recorded with the London Philharmonic. Coleman's ongoing experiments took him to Northern Africa to work with the master musicians, and he performed with an electric ensemble he called Prime Time. He was a recipient of Guggenheim Fellowships for Composition, a MacArthur Grant, and the prestigious Gish Prize in 2004. In 2007, he received the Pulitzer Prize in Music for his recording Sound Grammar and a Grammy Lifetime Achievement Award. Randolph Denard Ornette Coleman died June 11, 2015. He was 85. This is Aaron from One Track Jazz. Thanks for listening, and don't forget to like and subscribe.